there, everyone. My name is Rio. I am the Humanities Director here at Hamilton Education, and today we'll be working through our ACT Test 403. We're looking at the reading side. So I'm going to take us through every single passage and every single question on this 403 reading. For each passage, I'm going to spend some time going over just the passage itself, because as we know, we need to solve our P's and our Q's. And I'm also going to spend some time for each of the questions. So uh, follow this video and click through the chapters in order to watch passage overviews or question overviews in order to feel more confident in your ability to navigate the ACT here at Hamilton Education. All right, so we're working on passage one here. To start, we're going to just analyze the passage itself. So this is a literature passage, a prose fiction passage. So one passage on the ACT, always the first passage, is going to be literature or fiction. All right. So these fiction passages are a little bit trickier. Now, um, for your sake, one of the reasons why these are tricky is because probably throughout high school, throughout middle school, throughout your whole life, when you talk about fiction, you kind of talk about what happens from a plot perspective. But we don't have enough room on an ACT in order to really talk about plot. So instead, we talk about characters, we talk about setting, and we talk about tone. We also always want to be on the lookout for a pivot. So this particular passage has a really strong pivot. We have three, okay? We learn things with each pivot. So our first section is about the beginning of the recurring dream with fire, all right? And this idea of, being her father's daughter, okay? The narrator being her father's daughter. This dream is intense, there's fire, there's flight, all sorts of fancy. Then we have a really big pivot right here. I'm going to highlight this pivot um, in orange, okay? Right here is our pivot, okay? We have another dream, okay? And this dream is in fact a memory, okay? So our next part of the story we have goes basically from here to here, in which our narrator has a dream that tells us the memory that she had. All right. Then we get our final pivot, right, which kind of reveals the real setting of this passage, which is basically when we introduce the fact that we're kind of obviously living in something after cities exist. We don't know exactly what happened. We don't know if this is post-apocalyptic. We don't know if there was a nuclear war, anything like that. But we see there's city lights now, I say to her, after the narrator's stepmother claims that, one point in time, stars were hard to see because there were so many city lights. Now the Milky Way is always out because there's so few city lights. But the narrator, the daughter, who clearly wasn't around for when this before time that the stepmother understands, says, there's city lights now. They don't hide the stars. The mother says, there aren't anywhere near as many as there were now. Kids today have no idea what city lights used to be like, not that long ago. The daughter says, I'd rather have the stars. The mother, the stepmother, responds, stars are free, but I'd rather have the city lights soon, right? Back. Okay, so obviously she laments what has changed. So what do we have here? We have a strong first section that's really giving a lot of imagery, that's creating a tone, right? This first part of the essay in the blue really, really contributes to a tone of kind of like doom, right? Trying to fly, fire being everywhere, kind of a disaster. Then we have our second passage, which is a really kind of nice memory, okay, of being outside in the dark, putting clothes up to dry, laying in a basket of laundry, and looking up at the beautiful stars in their pale, glinting light on a warm night. And then we finally have the big reveal in the final just couple paragraphs of this passage, which say basically, cities have gone away. We don't know why, but they've gone away in the lifespan of the stepmother and recently just before the birth of the narrator of this passage. Right? So understanding structure, understanding sections, as a way to reveal tone, right? We have a big tonal shift here at that pivot in orange, is probably the best way to understand what's going on in this passage directly. Now, with that, we'll move on to the questions themselves. All right, so the ACT is hard. We're looking at question 1 here because it asks us to do a different task than we have done in our English classes in the past. We're not being asked to infer what could be true. We're not being asked to choose something that we can prove with our own evidence, right? We're being asked to choose an answer choice that cannot be wrong, okay? The reason why C is our best answer choice for question 1 is because there's really nothing wrong with it. Uh, in the passage, doesn't the narrator recollect a dream? Yes. And doesn't this dream seem to be related to an early memory? Yeah, right. She's dreaming about something that did happen, okay? Especially at the end. So nothing wrong with C. Nothing wrong with C. Now, some of our other answer choices could possibly be right, but is there anything in the passage that directly suggests that those things are true? No. Right. So an answer choice like B. Um, Obviously, there seems to be some insinuation of a little bit of conflict with her father. When she dreams to try to be like the person her father wants her to be, she's dreaming of fire. Okay, that's not that good. She's dreaming of flying, though, which maybe is good. Okay, so there seems to be some conflicted feelings, right? But is this what is characterizing this passage? Well, if the whole second two-thirds of the passage are about not her father, we can't say that. Okay, so if you're missing question 1, I really recommend you go back one video and watch my overall passage overview that talks about this passage as a whole in depth. Okay, so if you're missing question 1, you got to know what the passage is doing. It's not that you didn't solve the passage. D, could it be true that she's closer with her stepmother than her father? I mean, it kind of seems like it may be in the passage, right? It seems like she has a more intimate relationship with her stepmother, who she talks to in Spanish while doing laundry, than her father, who, she's seemingly dreaming of in a fire. But there's no explanation, right? Is there an explanation of this? No, that's what can't work there. And then finally, are these her earliest memories? No. So that's how we arrive to C for question 1. Remember to always get rid of answer choices that don't work rather than just looking for what you like. All right, so question 2, we're asked about the narrator's fluency in Spanish. Where does this take place in the passage? Well, it's in the second part, right? So she speaks Spanish because she's been taught Spanish by her stepmother. Okay, so she knows Spanish because her stepmother taught it to her, which reveals obviously they have some sort of dynamic, some sort of relationship, right? So, yeah, obviously, if she learns Spanish from her stepmother, they're spending time together, they have a real relationship. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with B. All right. Um, A, does she say that this is amazing? No. Also, did they really say that this is not her first language? We don't see that necessarily anywhere either. But the biggest thing is that, is it remarkable that she learned this thing? The passage doesn't suggest that, right? The narrator doesn't suggest that. Okay, is there a multilingual environment around her? All we know about her environment is that her stepmom was in it, okay? And that there's not a lot of city lights. We don't know if the whole rest of the world is multilingual. What if her mom is the only person that speaks Spanish on the planet, okay? That is too far of a inference for C. Um, and then D, if you read this too like in a literary way, like you might in an English class trying to analyze a poem, you might choose D. But again, the passage, we have to go based off of what it explicitly says. And is her father even present to be excluded from this conversation according to the passage? No, it's just her and her stepmother outside doing the laundry. So that's why we can get rid of A, C, and D, and that's why we can select B as correct for question 2. All right, so question 3 is a word and context question. Only a couple of these per ACT, okay? The SAT, they make up like 25 or more percent of the reading and writing score. On the ACT, you might see 3 or 4 on out of the full 36 reading questions. So maybe even like not even a tenth sometimes. All right. But with these word and context questions, we need to make sure we're doing two-factor authentication. We need to make sure we're double checking that the word has the right meaning as the answer we give it, and also that it fits in the context. So we have a couple things that do have a correct meaning for sweep. An overwhelming victory is a sweep, right? We see this, in sports. If you win all the games and the other team loses all the games, in let's say a playoff series or a three-game series in baseball, it's called a sweep. That's an overwhelming victory, right? If we clean something up, that is to sweep it, right? We use a broom to sweep up things. It also can mean a wide-ranging search, meaning we're going to go across, we're going to sweep the area to try to find something. But finally, sweep can also mean the sweep of the land, right? When you overview a wide territory all at once. All right, so all of the meanings are correct. So we really just have to look at fit. How do we know the fit is right? Okay, the broad sweep of the Milky Way means these stars are really big. Okay, the only answer choice that's going to fit here is one that suggests that it's big, which is D. Okay, is big a victory, a search, or a cleanup? No, we're just trying to say that the Milky Way is big, it takes up a lot of space, and D is what does that. So don't just look for a word that means sweep, make sure that it fits in the sentence as well. That's how we get to D. All right, so question 4 is asking about the purpose of a part of the passage. If you miss this question, it is likely that you're forgetting that when you are asked to understand the purpose of a part of a passage, you have to really consider the context of the passage as a whole. So if you missed 4, stop right now, go back to the passage overview video and watch that video. Okay? Because in that overview, we happen to talk about these lines directly, okay? Because it is a really important part in the passage where we see most clearly a pivot, okay? The strongest, trickiest passages on the ACT are those which have a pivot from one thing to another. And right here, which is highlighted in orange, we see that the passage is pivoting from a dream in which a girl is trying to fly and is on fire to a memory in the dream of a dream memory of like folding clothes outside in on a warm night when you can see the stars because there aren't many city lights. Okay, so remember, even though this is literature on the ACT, we're not asked to make an AP Lit style extrapolation. Right? We're trying to stay safe in our inferences. What can't be wrong? Well, we're going from something surreal, being on fire, to something realistic, hanging laundry. And that's exactly what we discussed in the passage overview. Okay. Um, Now, does she say that this next part is only her lived reality? No, it's a dream. We're not trying to blur this lines. Are we getting a mood of foreboding and prophecy? I mean, maybe at the end we get something kind of foreboding, but of prophecy, I'm not sure where that comes in. And then finally, signal to the reader that the narrator is unreliable, that goes too far. So A is what we got because that's what we saw right when we read the passage. We already discussed this. If you missed this, watch that passage overview. Always think about the context of the passage as a whole for a question like. All right, we want to make a very safe inference from a question like 5. Okay, so as we saw, this passage pivots somewhere in here where basically the passage goes from saying, um, you know, basically just kind of these things about a dream to revealing something more deep, right? This deep being like there used to be a lot of city lights, and those city lights would block out the stars, but now we don't have a lot of city lights, right? City lights, progress, growth, these are all things that we're too hot and too poor to bother with anymore. Okay, so things are too hot, they don't have enough money, we no longer have what used to define the society, which were city lights. Okay, as such, you can now see the stars. So, we know that the world once had more progress, okay? More developed, synonymous with progress. It was more prosperous, right? She says we're too poor now. That means in the past they had more money. Okay. Um, C we know is not true because we have the rest of the context, right? If this right here is what refutes C. B, we're not talking about her eyesight deteriorating. I'm not sure where that would be necessarily. And then finally, A, while she may, perhaps we can read that she's saddened or something, this secretly doesn't make sense, nor are these lost opportunities of her youth. It seems like they're lost opportunities for society as a whole. So D is definitely the safest answer for question 5. That's how we arrive to it. All right, so question 6, this is kind of answered in the passage, right? We know why she is making sure her mom isn't looking at her when she jumps into the clothes, right? Why? Because she says that she hopes her mom's not watching her. Okay, all the wrong answer choices here are too much. We're reading too in depth. Okay, does she engage in self-reflection while laying in the pile of clothes? No, right? She just sees a meteor. Okay. Does she know that her stepmother has a constant eye on her? We don't know for sure, okay? This is not something that's said here. If her stepmother did have a constant eye on her, she probably would have been looking at her when she wanted to jump in. And then finally, D, she wears their stepmother would ask her about her dream. Remember, this is her dream, okay? It's a part of a dream that just happens to also be a memory. Okay, so there's something wrong with B, C, and D. A, very safe inference here, right? What can we infer if she's worried about her stepmother seeing her jump into clean laundry? Well, that her stepmother would disapprove. So that's how we get to A for question 6. Remember, on the ACT, we're making safe inferences, even in literature. All right, question 7 is one of those few ACT word and context questions. Remember, on the SAT, as much as like 30% of the test can be word and context on the reading and writing side, whereas on the ACT, never really seeing more than 3 or 4, so like 10 to 12% of the reading test having anything to do with word and context. But when we're on the ACT, the biggest thing we want to do is make sure that our word both shares a meaning and fits. So looming can mean basically just like overwhelming, looking down on something, right? So, looming we see in line 57 is this scary neighborhood wall that looks kind of like a massive crouching animal that is threatening. Okay, so all of that stuff leads to menacing. If you don't know what the word menacing means, it means scary. It means threatening. Right? So it's a perfect match. If you're missing this question, it's probably not your strategy. It's probably not your approach. It's probably that you just don't know enough vocab. Question like 7 is going to be solved by studying vocab on your own. You're going to need to do it for the SAT. If you're studying for the SAT, it will help on the ACT as well. So 7, just study some vocab, y'all. All right, so question 8, we're being asked to infer something. We want to make sure we're making a safe inference on the ACT. We can't infer or choose an answer choice that might be true. We have to choose something that must be true. So what does she say? Now that she's an adult, she looks on stars relatively different, right? How do we know this? Right here, okay? Right here, she says um, she wasn't able to see the stars as a child, right? But now that she is older, she's able to see the stars because we no longer have city lights. This means at one point she thought these stars were windows into heaven, but now she doesn't, right? She only believed that for a year. So if she believed that for only a year, that means her opinion, her beliefs have changed. Clearly, B says that, right? She once looked at them as a source of hope and reassurance, but does she now look at them that way for C? No, right? D, they do seem to, have something to do with her mother, but does she say they remind her of her mother? No. And nostalgia, she's not happy, it's not wistful, it's not nostalgia, right? Finally, coming catastrophes, seems like the catastrophes already came. So there's something wrong with A, C, and D, nothing wrong with B. That's how we arrive to it for question 8. All right, so question 9. We cannot infer something too crazy from what we hear in lines 91 to 92, right? Kids today have no idea what cities' lights used to be like and what they used to be like just not even that long ago. Okay, so a lot has changed. City lights used to be a lot brighter, but now they're so dark that you can see the Milky Way in a city. So, nothing wrong with C, right? It's not the most radical, it's not the most interesting interpretation, but there's nothing wrong with it, right? A, that's something that she wishes for, but this they will again. That's too there's too much assurance for an answer choice like A. B, no one can remember the time when cities flourished. Well, isn't she remembering it right here? So maybe children can't remember it because they were too young or they weren't yet born, but people still are able to remember it because the stepmother still remembers it. Then finally, this part, have they been better planned? That's nowhere that really supports that. So that's what we get to C for question 9. Now we'll move on to passage 2 and the rest of the reading section of this ACT 403. All right, y'all. So I already kind of highlighted the important elements of this second passage from the reading section of test 403, We're talking about this passage, Cultural Baggage by Barbara Ehrenreich. Now, the tone of this passage is a little self-satisfied, and it's seemingly a little bit, I highlighted this at the end here. This whole quote kind of feels, no offense to Barbara, seems to be a really smart lady in many, many ways, a good writer, but man, that last paragraph is a little bit, too on the nose. Her chest swelling with pride as her kids say, um, uh, the world would be a better place if nobody else did either. Right? Like, okay, like that's what they said, these like 16-year-olds in the 90s. Seems a little bit on the nose. But let's just talk about what this passage is really saying. So we get really introduced to the main kind of claim up here. Um, so she says, like, what is her cultural background? What is her cultural heritage? What's her ethnic background? She thinks it's nothing, right? So why does she think that this is nothing? Well, because her cultural heritage is completely from outside of herself, right? Her mom or her dad was a miner in Butte, Montana, and she's having ethnic food, but that ethnic food is not from her own ethnicity. It's from a community of workers, right? She's descended about certain things about, or she's interested in certain things about her descent, but it doesn't actually, it's like an abstract uh interest, right? It's not like she actually is doing any of these things. For example, like she's fascinated to just learn that they were descended from these people. No one really, asked her to be a part of this cultural heritage ahead of time, right? Um, she does seem to think a little bit that like, ooh, like maybe my cultural heritage isn't all that interesting, even if I were to embrace it, right? But she's gone through generations apparently of not having a cultural heritage in terms of an ethnic heritage, right? So now you may be thinking to yourself, all right, so she has no background, she has no ethnic background, right? But she does have a cultural social background, right? What is her background? Um, Not believing in God ultimately, all right, and things of that nature, right? Um, her her background is based upon what is her lack of a background, which comes from her parents and her grandparents and so on, right? She's inheriting a certain socio-economic, cultural point of view from her parents. And that is what she is endeavoring to pass on, right? Think for yourself and always ask why. We see highlighted in the paragraph beginning line 60. Okay. That is what she inherited, right? Now, again, she gets a little bit kind of, preachy here. Um, she seems to say like, again, this quote, like she asks her kids whether they have any ethnic or religious identity, and they say none, and the world would be a better place if nobody else did. Then she says, my chest swelled with pride, as would my mother's, to know that the race of none marches on. Okay, that's cloying. All right, that's really kind of saccharine to continue to use SAT words, all basically saying that's too sweet. That's something that I just don't believe. I don't think that happened. But nonetheless, it does show what her actual heritage is and what she's actually passing down, which is her lack of a heritage, right? Her cultural social heritage is her lack of an ethnic heritage, which is kind of a nuanced, complicated take, but we really see it here in this last paragraph structurally, which is what's going to lead us into our questions. So from that point, we now kind of understand what this passage is saying, and this, you know, aversion to uh, blindly considering your heritage to be just what people did before you in your family. And that's what the passage is as a whole, and now we move into the problems of the questions themselves. Okay. So if you missed question 10, you're gonna want to go back and watch my overview for this whole second passage because this passage, I can understand why you might think an answer choice like A, or an answer choice. Yeah, especially A would be the correct answer. Okay, I also can understand if you followed some baggage distractors why you would think B or D could be correct. But if you watch that passage overview, you'll understand that C is the only correct answer. Now, where is this most clearly stated in the passage? Let's go ahead and look at this last paragraph, right? She is saying ultimately that this identity of none, quote unquote, is what began with her mother, culminated in her, and is being passed down to her children, right? This is her identity, right? Where do we see this? We see it here. Think for yourself and always ask why, right? We see it here. Give me a break, Mom, the older one said. You don't even believe in God, right? We see all of these sort of instances of, think for yourself, right? A skeptical, scientific, humanitarian perspective towards identity and culture and society is something that can be passed down and become your kind of like, your identity rather than just by from whom you come in a, specific ethnic or racial sense. All right. Um, this would be a too extreme idea, a too extreme distractor. Okay, if you don't know what that means, look up your distractors. This is also too extreme distractor and a baggage distractor. Okay, there might be a lot of people nowadays who would say like, it's self-hatred to not, be interested in that. Also, uh, B connects to up here, so it's a recycled language distractor, but that's certainly not the main point, right? Um, and then finally, D is another maybe baggage distractor if, you're in like an ethnic group and you think it's stabilizing for yourself or for your family or something like that. That isn't necessarily the experience of the writer here. So we can only focus on the text. So B, really good baggage or a really good recycled language distractor. A, too extreme. Really study your distractors if you're missing 10 and watch the passage overview as a whole. And so 11's a pretty good question. We're asking, how does the author characterize her own view towards her English, Irish, and Scottish heritage? Well, it seems to be pretty what we would call like non-committal or blasé, or uh, it's not of the utmost importance to her, right? She's not connected to it. She sees it as, not really a part of her. Her identity is based off of actually her beliefs and her perspective, which comes from her parents and her ancestors, that isn't tied to her ethnic identity. So here she says, my ethnic identity is not all that important. Here she says, my ethnic identity is not all that important. Here we do get like a little bit of time when she's actually kind of curious about it, but other than that, not whatsoever. So that's how we get to B. Okay. Um, a is a really good distractor because she is interested in the idea of ethnic roots more now that her children are born, right? The notion of what is an ethnic group, but she's not more interested in her own ethnic group, right? Or her own ethnic roots. She's actually more interested in avoiding those roots, um, seemingly. Why else would she be proud that her children feel like they belong to no specific ethnic identity? Um, C, that's not true because uh, her parents really didn't care at all, right? She heard some passing things, but her parents were not a part of that. Nowhere does the passage suggest it. And then finally, she does look into some of its literary traditions for sure, and she does seem to reject some of the religious component of her ethnic heritage, but like that isn't enough to say that she actually embraces or is interested in her ethnic heritage. This one throwaway sentence of her saying she read a little bit of Sir Walter Scott. It's not enough to say D. So B has absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's really good. That's why we go with B for 11. Really look into distractors if you're missing a question like 11. You can study that from the week 1 packet in summer or Target or with your tutor. All right, 12 is a really straightforward detail question here. We're just being asked to go and look for as many of these things in the passage as possible. right? Highlander clothing is right here. Okay. Um, what was the other ones? Kwanzaa is right here. Purim is right here. Okay, so Purim, Kwanzaa, and Highlander clothes um, are all referenced. So because those things are referenced, we have to get rid of all of them. The only one that we don't see referenced anywhere is French cooking traditions, which is why we have to go with C. This is one of those questions where if you had 1,000,000 hours to go work on this ACT, I don't think there's really any chance that you're going to miss a question like 12. You just have to really be diligent, right? This is made difficult because we have a time constraint on the ACT. So if you're missing this question, even if you're not quote unquote running out of time at the end of the test, you might be misallocating your time because this is one of those questions where if you just allocate enough time to it, you're going to get it correct. And every correct answer is just in your back pocket. There's no correct answer that is more valuable than another correct answer, right? So 12 is a perfect opportunity for you to allocate your time and make sure you get this correct. Make sure you're moving fast enough through the test as a whole, the reading test as a whole, to give a question like 12 the time it is due, the time it requires, it deserves. All right, so question 13 is one of the few word and context questions we'll see on the ACT. Unlike the SAT, which is really vocab dominant, almost 25% of your score is going to come from vocab. On the ACT, we see maybe a couple questions, a test of word and context vocab stuff, but it's still important. So militant, we hear about militant in many different ways, right? Militant can have multiple meanings. Whenever we're asked a word and context question, we need to think about both the fit and the meaning. Can militant mean violent? Yes, absolutely. Can militant mean tyrannical? Yes, absolutely. Militant doesn't ever really mean inclusive, so that's one we can just throw out from the beginning with on the basis of meaning. But now A, B, and C all can mean militant. We just need to make sure that it fits in the sentence. So when we look to the sentence 18, um, it was militant ecumenism in all matters of food and experience. Okay, well, what does that mean? To try new things, to not value one thing over another. Okay, so she's saying that's exactly what we do, right? So anything from sweetbread to clams, we gotta try it, especially if it's new. Okay. So does that sound violent? No. Okay, so we can definitely get rid of violent. Now, does that sound tyrannical? Okay. Tyrannical would mean that like she's really, really being forced to, but it seems rather to be more of just like a very clear preference. All right. So strict is going to outweigh tyrannical because tyrannical connotatively is just too extreme here. Okay. So the connotation of words is really important. Tyrannical is a real dictator. Being strict about something just says like it's what you prefer very strongly. Okay, so that difference is nuanced, it's subtle, but it's real and it's significant enough to say that B is correct, but C is too far. So make sure you're setting your vocab if you can't, if there are any of these words you don't know, and make sure you're applying the two-factor ID, two-factor authentication of both. Does it mean the right thing and does it fit the sentence? All right, so question 14 is a inference question, okay? But on the ACT, on the SAT, anytime we're asked to infer something, right? See what's a suggestion in the passage, see what the author implies in the passage, we have to infer from the details. Okay, we can't infer anything too radical. We have to infer from the details. Okay, so what is actually detailed in this passage? So she details about her ethnic strain, right, which is this kind of like Britannic thing that they've had to do a lot of change, right? Um, how do we know this, right? This think for yourself notion might be the ideal cultural heritage for my particular ethnic strain. Notice we see that direct language right there, which is a good indicator that we're in the right spot. What better philosophy for a race of migrants than to think for yourself? What better maxim, which means kind of like core belief, for people whose whole world was rudely inverted every 30 years or so, then try new things, right? So if your world is inverted, I mean flipped upside down, right? When you invert something, you go from this to this. Every 30 years or so, what does that really directly suggest? It means that there's a lot of change. And as a consequence of that change, her progenitors, right, the people that came before her predecessors, they are people who have had to embrace and adapt to changes. All right. So D is correct, right? She's saying that basically the belief that was passed down to her from her parents perhaps comes from the fact that um, the kind of crew that they come from has had to be changed all the time, right? They've had to change all the time. Okay. So uh do they see this anywhere for her ethnic strain? Not for hers, right? Maybe elsewhere. Okay. B is an opposite distractor. She has a big affinity for Jewish people. Okay. She seems to think like the intellectualism of kind of like classic uh Jewish heritage and Jewish culture is really interesting to her. But is that her group? No, I mean, it directly says in the passage that her group is directly kind of contrasted with uh, Jewish culture in that paragraph beginning on line 29, right here. Okay. Um, and then finally, they have no cultural heritage to speak of. We know that's not true because there is some that exists, right? The tartan skirts from her grandma, which we saw up right here is something, right? But is that enough to say that she suggests, it's not much, but that's enough to suggest that they don't have no cultural heritage. They have at least a little, right? It's not a ton, but at least a little. So they've been forced to adapt to change. This is a really good answer choice for the ACT or the SAT, especially the ACT, because it's a really safe inference that goes directly from details, which is always what we want to do. So if you're missing this, really make sure you're basing your inferences on details in the passage. All right, so 15 is a really good rhetoric kind of question. Okay, so remember, rhetoric is the means by which we make an argument. All right, so rhetoric is all about the art of arguing. So she's making an argument in this passage, right? Which is that her personal kind of heritage and identity is a mental thing, right? It's a consequence of her social beliefs, her cultural upbringing, it, distanced from ethnic identity, right? Her ethnic identity isn't what determined who she was, but rather the things she grew up doing, right? She's not Cornish, but she's eating Cornish meat pies. Um, and that she inherited this from her parents and she's passing it on to her own children. So one of the big things that she does to kind of prove this point, to prove that she doesn't really have a direct ethnic identity that or a direct ethnic heritage that she identifies with, is to show that she identifies with people outside of her ethnic heritage, right? In particularly, she identifies with Rebecca, who is a Jewish woman in the poem Ivanhoe. All right. So that's why this is referenced, right? And we see this further, right? She's more interested in the kind of like orderly, literate lives instead of the, sort of, rampaging, blue painted Scotland people in the Highlands of Scotland, right? So she's showing like, look, this has happened to me before, right? In my past, I've always been more interested in identifying with people on the basis of personality than on the basis of like kind of stereotype of their ethnic group. Okay. Intellectual interest developed at a young age. Okay. Nah, right. Where she's not trying to show that she's precocious. She's not trying to show that like she's smart. She's trying to show that like this question of what is her ethnic identity has been around for a while. Um, so D, you think that she would make more than one argument for that, and I just don't think that that is understanding the context of the work as a whole. If we're ever going to answer a question which is asking for us to understand the purpose of a particular piece of an essay, a particular paragraph, a particular sentence, we have to remember to consider the context of the work as a whole. Does D kind of show that she's smart? Yeah, sure. But is that what it's doing for the essay as a whole? Does she feel like she needs to show that she's smart for her claim to be valid? No, she needs to show that her claim is valid on its own, right? And then finally, A, not whatsoever. She's not trying to refute Disraeli. Okay, that Disraeli is not someone she's arguing against. Disraeli is someone that is kind of like uh, just showing how why she's not connected to her particular ethnic heritage, but rather is more connected to a kind of intellectual, cultural heritage that is of not believing in an ethnic heritage. So, yeah, if you're missing a purpose question like this, a rhetoric question, always think about the broader context in order to determine it. All right, so question 16 is just like question 15, asking us to understand the purpose or the point of a piece of writing within a passage. And the thing that is probably getting you, if you're missing a question like this, is you're not sufficiently considering the surrounding context, right? We need to understand the passage as a whole in order to understand the point of a portion of the passage. Okay, so what is the point of the passage as a whole? Well, it's to make the claim that uh, her heritage is of changing, of embracing the new, of questioning what came before, and that this heritage is what she inherited from her parents and what she's passing on. And it isn't tied to ethnicity, but rather to kind of like a perspective towards the world, right? The skepticism, okay? Skepticism without a negative connotation. So, why does she bring up grandma? Okay. It isn't to say that any of these other things, right, which could be true. I mean, it does say that she was an immigrant, right? Perhaps. Or we could maybe infer that. That's probably too far, actually. But it seems like maybe she could have been an immigrant. But is that relevant to the passage as a whole? Why the vacuum cleaners come up? No. Let's really just look at this paragraph, right? Her mother, who she inherited, so the author of this piece inherited her perspective towards life from her mother. And her mother was somebody who never used a grandma did it this way or grandma did it that way in order to validate her own claims, right? According to the author of this, her mom's value was all in trying new things and understanding what was best in the moment, okay? So, why does the notion of grandma using a vacuum cleaner or the notion of using your grandmother's cleaning ways come up? Because what would a grandmother have to say about cleaning if she's never used a vacuum cleaner, right? We need to be adaptable, like we see up here, right? Think for yourself. Always ask why, right? And always change, okay, like we see here. All of these things are the antithesis to the notion of just doing what grandma did. Because how do we know the value of what grandma did if she didn't even have a vacuum cleaner? Okay, so what answer choice lines up with this idea? Clearly A, right? Now, it doesn't say are never useful. It says they're not always useful. Okay, that's a really good safe inference. All right, this is not a too extreme distractor because that word not comes before the always. Not always useful means sometimes useful. Always useful means too much. That's too extreme, but that's not what we're asked. All right, so that's how we arrive to A for question 16. These other ones just are not related to the context of the passage as a whole. So if you're missing this, make sure you understand the passage as a whole and maybe watch the passage overview and make sure you're considering the context whenever you're asked about the purpose of just a particular piece of a passage. Oops. All right, so our next question, 17, is asking us about values in line 76. It might sound a little bit like a word and context question. We're being asked about vocab, but we're really not. We're being asked to refer back to something in the passage. So what are the values she's talking about? They remain loyal to the values that may have induced all of our ancestors to climb down from the trees, right? So her personal line of progenitors is her particular ethnic strain, okay? So what did she say about her particular ethnic strain? Well, we would know if you looked at question 14, all right? Question 14 does a really good job of explaining what is the beliefs of her particular ethnic strain, right? Which is curiosity, right? This notion of think for yourself, always ask why, allow your things to change, to try new things. Okay, this value of trying new things, thinking for yourself, always asking why, this is what her group believed, and that's the thing that she's happy about. And it seems like these values maybe are the first thing to have started humans to begin to be real humans, as opposed to apes living in trees without civilization or society, right? So curiosity is what maybe moved us to civilization, and it's a value that seems to have been continued from the people that she sees herself as descending from, which is very broad, right? Her parents are, it's not that she's descending from British people, but rather that she's descending from people who hold these kinds of beliefs. So that's how we get to curiosity. Chauvinism, ethnic chauvinism, she doesn't see that as a value, right? She thinks that's a problem. We see that in the second paragraph. Religious disillusionment is something that she sort of agrees with, but that's not what is the value, right? Is religious disillusionment why we decided to climb down from the trees? No. Okay. And then self-discovery is maybe a baggage distractor if you associate things like asking questions, wondering why, um, always, being curious as self-discovery. Well, curiosity is first. Okay. Curiosity is a much safer inference for all that than self-discovery is. So that's how we get to B for question 17. All right, so question 18. If you missed question 18, you got to watch the passage review as a whole, okay? Go back a couple of chapters in this video, wherever you're watching it, and watch the description of the passage as a whole, because this is a tricky thing, okay? This passage isn't saying that she has no heritage. It's not saying that she has no tradition. Rather, it is saying that she doesn't belong to an ethnic tradition that is the basis of her heritage, right? The fact that her ethnic background just so happens to be British and Scottish and whatever is not sufficient for it to be what her heritage is. Not to be, it's not what uh, defines her kind of like tradition, her identity, or anything. Instead, this passage as a whole suggests that she is embodying the perspectives that were passed down to her from her parents. Her parents passed down to her the ideas of curiosity, open-mindedness, change, and trying new things, right? This is the tradition that they passed on to her and is now, as we see right here, the tradition that she is passing on to her children. Now, her children show how it's being passed on in a really corny way. We belong to none, and the world would be a better place if nobody else did either. Okay, guys, sure. All right. But then we see the most telling sentence. My chest swelled with pride. My chest swelled with pride, as would my mother's, to know that the race of none marches on. Okay, so this none race is the one that her mom, and her children all believe, which is an embrace of those ideas of trying new things and curiosity, etc. All right, so there is a new tradition. The new tradition just is the thing called none, right? So to say that none is a new tradition is kind of funny. Okay, so that's why we have B. Um, Now, she's not mocking people for believing in an ethnic thing, right? We see that up here that it's okay. All right. She says that skeptically, she says, these things are cool, but I would just say that curiosity and tolerance are also worthy elements of the human tradition, right? Um, she also isn't trying to persuade her children to agree with her. They already agree with her, so that's what's wrong with D. And then finally, does she have a total lack of heritage? That word total is a too extreme distractor here because she does have a heritage. It just so happens to be a perspective on life as opposed to a kind of like cultural tradition that's tied to land or race or ethnicity, right? So that's how we get through the second passage. We'll move on over to the third passage now as we continue through ACT 403 reading. All right, so now we move on to the third passage of this ACT 403. This is a paired passage. So not every ACT does have a paired passage where we see two passages in one, but many of them do. So we do need to know how to navigate a paired passage. First, we're just going to go through and understand each of these passages and how they relate to one another. So the same thing for both the shared topic for both passages is about life phases, right? Um, so when do we travel from being a child to being an adult? Okay. Our first passage, though, is really focused on one particular moment. We're adding a term and we're defining it. Okay. Um, Odyssey. So we know that this is the least understood, and it's the era between adolescence and adulthood. So, what is the Odyssey situation? Why is this a new situation, which is the big argument of Passage A? Um, well, uh, we have this transition phase is taking longer, right? Um, things are delayed, right? So what's being delayed? Marriage, children, employment, right? In 1960, we had 70% of 30-year-olds doing these things, but then by 2000, which of course is nearer than 1960, less than 40%. All right. Um, but our author, um, excuse me, our author is attempting to recontextualize this delay as not necessarily uh, a willful act. It's not as though people nowadays just want their Odyssey to be longer. Um, it's not about slacking off. There seems to be fewer opportunities, right? There are many highly traditional aspirations. They want the things that were more common in the past, but it is a new phase. Okay, it's coming just like adolescence, which is once was a new phase. It is becoming, um, you know, more important. Um, and okay, then our second passage talks specifically about um, kind of the same thing, but it doesn't define this term in exactly the same way, right? It's talking about when do we become an adult, right? It isn't really concerned about anything else. So we see that this is a murky and confusing time, and that adulthood can take place at a variety of ages. Um, so why is Vietnam referenced here? Well, we see that um, at some points we see aging as the time to vote, right? So being able to vote when you're 18 and older uh, is maybe in adulthood because that's when you go to war or anything like that. But now we see that adulthood, as it is kind of understood to be marriage or having children or what have you, um, we see it as coming much later now, right? Uh, Median age for first marriage was around 20.8 for women and 23.2 for men during the Vietnam War. Now, in 1994, much later, it's raised significantly in both instances, right? And making a very similar argument to Passage A, assembling the pieces that define adulthood is what is leading to this kind of tricky navigation, um, because those things are becoming more difficult to obtain, according to the passage, right? Um, if, you know, we make certain standards as the definition of when someone becomes an adult based off of what we saw amongst baby boomers, we may never see adults again if homeownership is, say, for example, integral part of adulthood. So both passages are basically talking about what defines being an adult, how do we end up being an adult, and that external societal level things are impacting when we can or when we can become an adult or say that someone is an adult definitionally. So those are the two passages. We've solved them both now. From there, we move into the questions themselves. All right, so question 19, we're talking specifically about passage A. We want to know what are the main points about the Odyssey period. Okay, we don't want to make too far of an inference from any of these answer choices. All right, remember we are on the ACT, and just like when we're on the SAT, we want to make sure that we are not going too far. We can't make an inference that would be supported in, an English class, right? We have to choose something that cannot be wrong. All right, so could it be true that a long Odyssey period increases anxiety? It could be true, right? But is it stated in the passage? Is it a main claim of the passage? No, right? Um, this is a too extreme distractor, okay, because they're lazy, right? In fact, we see the opposite, right here. That says that they're not lazy, okay? Um, People who have long Odyssey years tend to resent adulthood. Is this plausible? Sure, but is it attested to directly in the passage? No. All right, so which one is directly attested to in the passage? C, right? Why do we know this? Okay, we see it right here. The least understood is the Odyssey period. So, least understood and most misunderstood are very, very, very synonymous. Okay, so remember with these detail kind of questions, our answer choices are very verbatim in the text. Don't go too far in the way in what you infer for a question like 19. All right, so question 20, we're asked to go to some specific portion of the paragraph. All right, so if you're looking at this test on our online format, it'll say highlighted text. If you're seeing it on paper, it'll tell you what lines to go to directly, but either way, we know where to go. What can we infer about younger generations from this portion right here? Okay, they are delaying marriage, they're delaying having children, they're delaying permanent employment, things that people born before 1964 defined as being part of adulthood, right? However, nowadays, these are no longer exactly how we would define. Um, so remember, even if we are using one particular place to base our analysis, it doesn't mean that we ignore the whole rest of the passage, right? Context is essential for any question. So in the same way, you can't really know what a car's engine does or what the wheels of a car do without looking at the car as a whole, right? You can't know that an engine is supposed to turn things unless you see everything else. You're not going to know what the fourth paragraph's full role is without looking everywhere else. So what can we infer about these younger generations? Well, the traditional timelines of producing adulthood by boomer generation is just not able to be followed, right? They are not inclined to follow that. Now, it doesn't say that they're not inclined to do that because of beliefs or feelings or anything like that. It's just that they're not inclined to do that, right? The word inclined does not have any sort of judgment or value judgment attached to it. Okay. Um, so this could be true, right? This is written before the COVID pandemic, but a lot of Gen Z graduating into the COVID pandemic were very concerned about their job prospects. Okay. But is it stated in that paragraph or in the passage specifically? No, right? They are interested apparently, right? But is this a central tenet of this paragraph here? No. All right. Finally, are these opportunities that were previously denied? No, we're talking about the fact that they are delaying uh, the traditional timeline because of, circumstances that are causing them to delay that. So answer choice A is the only completely defensible claim here, the only one that has nothing wrong with it. Okay, so question 21 has some great baggage distractors in it. All right. How many times have you heard perhaps parents or friends of parents or uncles or aunts or cousins or someone on the news, on social media, talking about um, how is the younger generation navigating their transition to adulthood? Why is Gen Z taking so long to create families? Why are millennials kind of acting like children forever? Um, we've seen all those videos. But we have to only go based off of what the passage itself says. Okay. So an answer choice like D, all right, this might be something that you believe, or it might be something that you typically see in an essay like this. But does this essay particularly say that this is detrimental to society? I want to point to what says that no, this isn't necessarily detrimental to society as a whole. Okay. Some parts of society flourish, right? Teach for America, knitting circles. Okay. Those are like some classic kind of millennial things or, older Gen Z things, right? Uh, Run Club is really popular right now. What have you. These things maybe flourish in one moment, right? While other parts of society aren't quite as successful, such as going to church or being a part of a political party. All right. So he isn't saying that church or political parties are more important than Teach for America, right? He's just saying that they're valued differently by a long Odyssey period. Okay. This is to extreme and baggage, right? Employment opportunities being limited is the exact cause of a long Odyssey year. So that's logically indefensible. And then finally, A is an opposite distractor. The younger generation has longer Odyssey periods than their parents. If we flip-flopped for some reason between parents and the younger generation, we might arrive at A. So that's how we get to answer choice B here. Right. Okay. Now with question 22, we're on the next passage. Why? Because we know that the Vietnam War is only talked about in this passage. Okay. So why do we mention the Vietnam War? Well, because we see here in the 1970s and late 1960s, how we see the transition from childhood to adulthood changes because of the Vietnam era, right? The age of the majority was lowered from 21 to 18 because of voting and because of the military, all right? So we start seeing as 18 as the beginning of adulthood beginning in 1970 because of these different things, right? The Vietnam War particularly. So we see adulthood as beginning then because a bunch of kids are getting shipped off to war at age 18, and they want to, as a consequence, have families sooner, make sure they have a stable job when they get back, things of that nature, right? So B is a very good baggage distractor. If you know a little bit about the 60s, there was a lot of opposition to the Vietnam War, and a lot of that kind of came in critique of traditional social, conservatism. And, but that's not why we see a change in when we understand adulthood. Okay, that's according to the passage, it's about going to war and voting, right? Is C possibly true about Vietnam? Yes, but is that why the war comes up in the passage? No, we have to be specific. Okay. D, do we compare the United States and Vietnam marriage rates? No, we compare marriage rates in 1993 or something like that with 1970. So that's how we arrive to A for question 22. Make sure you're only going based off of the passage. Don't choose to use your own personal experience, your own understanding of history, anything like that to answer a question like 22. Right, question 23 is a really solid example of a detailed question. Okay, we are being asked to find all of the following except, okay? So this is one of those questions where if you had 10 minutes to answer this question on its own, there's nothing you'd get wrong, right? Because you would just go through that second passage, that second of the two paired passages, and find each of the ones that are mentioned, and the one that you cannot find would be the correct answer. So we want to try to do that though really quickly, right? Because the ACT can stress us on time. So if you're missing a question like 23, I would say that the real issue probably isn't this question itself, but rather your pacing earlier on in the test. Okay, so we will just go find parenthood, marriage, and voting here. Okay, so parenthood is right here, right? We see them talking about parenthood there. We also see marriage. Marriage is talked about, and parenthood. Marriage and parenthood are both discussed from here to here as a way of discussing markers of adulthood. And then finally, voting is referred to up here talking about adulthood, right? And here. Okay, so all three of those are attested to, so we have to get rid of all of them, right? Parenthood, marriage, and voting are all talked about. So car ownership, is that talked about in the second passage? No. Okay, so we can know that car ownership is not in the text. So we can select D here by omission. Really make sure you're, one, reading every word of every question. Make sure you read that word accept. It's really important. Secondly, if you're missing this, it's probably because you're just spending too much time on other questions. When a question like this is a guaranteed correct answer, if you can just spend enough time on it. All right, so for question 24, we're asked to look at this last paragraph and identify what the passage author thinks is the reason for why we should identify new milestones that define when adulthood has begun. Okay, so where does he start talking about this? So he pulls from psychologist Ross Goldstein, who says it may be time to redefine the measures, the meaning of being grown up, right? Why? Because assembling these pieces are difficult. Okay, what does that mean, right? If we're using the same standards, if we continue to apply the same standards, we may discover that some people will never grow up, right? If the standard for becoming an adult is owning a home, having children, being married, perhaps, having a lucrative job, all these things right here, right? Hallmarks. These hallmarks define adulthood. There are many, many people who are in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s that never meet any of those standards. Maybe the majority of Americans no longer meet those standards any point in their life. Does that mean they will never be an adult? That doesn't seem very sensible of a parameter, right? So the traditional hallmarks that were ascribed to the previous generation are just perhaps not a sensible definition of adulthood if the majority of people don't reach those, right? I'm talking about future generations is incorrect there, right? It's actually later generations. C, less burdened by challenges. There are different challenges according to the passage, but they don't compare them in terms of value. And then D, this heavily based on male experience is kind of a, perhaps a baggage distractor that may be something you think, but it isn't attested to in the passage itself. So remember, the passage is the main thing we use. That's where we're looking. That's where we're getting our answers. That's how we get to B for question 24. All right, so question 25 is now asking us to synthesize these two passages, which paired passages on the ACT is very typical. We're asked to synthesize. It's on the SAT too. All right, though much shorter on the SAT. So what are both of these passages highlighting? As we talked about in the passage overview, both passages are suggesting that our transitional period, right, from becoming an adult is taking longer, right? Passage A defines it with its own kind of category, the Odyssey years. But passage B just says that, adulthood is getting harder to define and it's taking a longer time, right? We see that here for passage B, and then passage A, it's everywhere, right? Delaying, delaying, delaying. Okay, so both passages really clearly are saying that younger generations are taking longer to reach adulthood. All right. So C is wrong because a major historical event would mean one specific one. Yes, passage B says that about the Vietnam War, but does passage A talk about a specific historical event? Does it say the COVID-19 pandemic or the financial crisis of 2008 or the, invasion by the United States of Iraq or Afghanistan or something like that? No, that's not stated anywhere in the text specifically. So a major historical event does not do A. Neither passage A nor B say that we should return to traditional models of adulthood. They both seem to suggest that those traditional models are going to have some inefficiencies. And then finally, D, this parental anxiety is attested to some degree in A, but it's not about children moving away from childhood. And again, additionally, B doesn't talk about that at all. So it has to be true in both passages, and only A is true for both. All right, so 26 is asking us to synthesize these two passages, just like question 25, just like pretty much every SAT paired passages or on the ACT too. So we're asking to compare the passages. Remember, a comparison does not mean that they have to be incompatible. It doesn't mean that it's not just contrast, right? Sometimes students seem to think that when we compare two things, we are saying that they're different from one another. We're actually just saying what is the relationship between them, right? So ultimately, D is definitely correct. If you're missing this question, you gotta watch my passage overall overview, which is a few videos back in this sequence. So you didn't understand the passage here. Remember, there are questions that we have to solve the passage in order to understand. There are questions where we have to just understand the question to understand. Um, so yeah, 26 is a overall sort of thing. Let's see what's wrong in some of these other ones, right? Passage A is not necessarily critical of the younger generation, right? Um, it just seems to be more I would say objective about the younger generation. And passage B doesn't even really like say all that much with empathy or whatever. It just seems to define and describe. All right. Um, C, the younger generation's lack of motivation. Remember, there is a quote in passage A which says they are not slacking off, right? So we can say that that is not true in passage A, so it can't be true for both. And then B doesn't talk about personal experience whatsoever. So that's why each of these are wrong. You can get rid of those. And then D is correct because of everything we described in the overall overview video for this passage. All right, so question 27. If you're missing this, I think you're probably focusing too much on like trying to figure out something very specific rather than saying which of these is wrong, right? Um, so certainly B is correct because yes, passage B talks about the Vietnam War. Does passage A talk about the Vietnam War at all? No, right? There's nowhere in passage A that directly refers to the Vietnam War whatsoever. So now, is that the difference that you seem to maybe ascribe to these two passages? It might not be where you are focused on their differences, right? So remember to really just like, see, is this answer choice correct or incorrect on an answer by answer basis? Be deductive in your reasoning, okay? It can't be A because both use a lot of statistics. Both are really statistically based, right? They in fact refer to some very similar to statistics about when marriage takes place or things like that, okay? I would say that passage B probably has even more statistics, right? Statistics all here, statistics all here, whereas passage A really only talks about statistics right here, okay? There is definitely not a criticism of young people who depend on their parents in 27. And in fact, there isn't really much discussion of young people depending on their parents financially either way, right? Just that they're not able to buy their own home, not dependents to chew. And then finally, D, the more recent analysis, that is not true because passage B, the most recent analysis, the most recent figures that they provide are from 1993, whereas passage A, the most recent figures that they provide are from 2010. So in fact, A is a little bit newer, all right? So the only thing that is, can't be wrong, that can't be eliminated from question 27 is B. So that's how we write to the correct one. With that, we finish our third paragraph, our third passage, excuse me, and we move on to our fourth passage, going to overview the whole thing and then move through each question. All right, so now we begin on the fourth passage here, just going to fully overview the passage as a whole because on any ACT or any SAT, we always have to solve the problems in the passage for reading before we solve the problems of the questions. The passage as a whole is relatively straightforward, but we do want to clarify what its real focus is. Okay, so this passage is focused on cataloging planets and seeking to find ultimately indications of possible life on other planets. All right, so we start off with kind of classic natural science construction. We're introducing our question here, which is ultimately, um, might there be a planet out there suitable for life? So now we then introduce a problem right here, which is also classic of a natural science passage. Our problem is that we can't look into these planets other than except from very far, right? Um, if life is on another planet, it is much more likely that it is uh, primitive life than incredibly sophisticated life that could transmit something detectable to us in the form of radio signals. So we're going to have to look for what are called biosignatures, right? Markers of a planet that crawls with the life as we know it, right? Um, biosignatures would found in an exoplanet would give us the first clues that we are not alone, all right? So um, what have we done now to look into this? So this is published in 2016, talking about the launch of a transiting exoplanet survey satellite and a James Webb Space Telescope, both of which, when combined, will give us some hints or some insight into other exoplanets. Okay, so um, we can use the transit method, transits, in order to uh, check into other planets. But transit method ultimately really only is very good at picking up large, giant planets with large atmospheres as opposed to planets that might be more like Earth. Um, but the James Webb space category and all of this down here um, will be able to look in a little bit more deeply, right? So the James Webb will seek out stars and perhaps look at the atmosphere, which again will give us biosignatures of a few habitable super Earths. Um, but it'll be hard to get targets, and the ultimate way to get those targets is with this other program tests. So this here kind of answers the question over here, or the point, which is to say, um, not just on its own, but together, James Webb and TESS will offer us an opportunity to search for alien life by looking for biosignatures, etc., on other planets. So that's what the passage as a whole, and then we'll move into the questions and navigate them one by one. All right, so question 28 is the first question for this fourth passage. It's asking about the primary purpose. Remember, on the ACT or the SAT, very often we are being asked to control our inferences, to choose a safe inference, all right? Um, so, and we are also asked to really navigate distractors and find single words that make an answer choice wrong. So I just want to point out what's wrong in some of these answer choices. Like A, outline the development of a revolutionary new technology. So this does seem to be like a revolutionary new technology, absolutely. But do we learn at all about how this comes into being? Are they talking about how they developed the TESS? Are they talking about how they developed the James Webb Space Telescope? Not really at all. All right. So we're just talking about uh, the technology itself, but not its development. So that word alone is enough to make A incorrect. Um, C is kind of off the base in general, right? I don't think that we're casting doubt on anything. We are showing a new thing, so we are going against to some degree, a commonly performed thing, but I don't really see the doubt issue. Um, and then finally, D, we do have an ongoing endeavor that has a maybe newer interest in it with these launches. However, looking for increased monetary support, where is that supported in the text? I don't see that anywhere. So we ultimately have to go with B. Why is B correct? I mean, we have an area of research, which is exoplanets, and then we're talking about how do we do this, right? How do we navigate this? Well, point by point, we go through and we see that we can use all these new forms to look into exoplanets, right? And we combine them with older forms of how we navigated this and come to you know, a future situation where in which James Webb and the TSS are gonna work, TESS, excuse me, are gonna work together to find possibly habitable planets. So that's how we get to B for question 28. Okay, so question 29 is a great example. The answer choices, at least, are great examples of two extreme distractors. All right, which are answer choices that are plausible, perhaps, but really can't be confirmed because they go and say it's something absolute. So, some examples, right? B, definite proof of life. Uh, would the discovery of water on an exoplanet provide plausible proof of conditions for life or something like that? Yeah, absolutely. But definite proof of life is too extreme, right? Does this third paragraph, lines 14 to 21, right here, does this suggest that perhaps there's a situation in which life is different from what we know on planet Earth, and therefore there are different biosignatures? Um, yeah, okay. It says that, right? Life as we know it. That does sort of infer or imply that, perhaps life could be different on another planet. However, it will produce, that's too extreme, right? Getting rid of A, getting rid of B on those bases. Okay. And then finally, our current technology is not sophisticated enough yet to detect biosignatures. Um, it doesn't seem like that this is suggested whatsoever in this paragraph, right? We can infer from elsewhere that James Webb is going to be better at picking up biosignatures, which is yet to be launched at the time of this writing. However, according to that paragraph, really what we're saying is that all of these things here, right? Water, dioxide, oxygen, ozone, are biosignatures, right? Because on Earth, we have a bunch of oxygen because we have living organisms. So we can positively infer D, and we have to get rid of A, B, and C, especially A and B on the basis of being too extreme. So really look out for common distractors on these ACT questions. Okay, so question 30 is a direct detail question. All right, this is a question that we just should get right given enough time. Now, you're in the last passage of the ACT. If you move a little bit too slow, this is one of those questions where you might not have enough time to give it the credit it's due. But remember, this is a question you can guaranteed get correct if you just find it in the passage. This is a great question to allocate your time to try to find the answer, right? This is not one to guess on, okay? So, why do we want to uh, spend time on it? Because all we have to do is find it in the text, which we can see right here, orbit faint red suns called M dwarfs, and know for certain that a faint red sun is what is an M dwarf, right? So, detail questions, when they say according to the passage, oftentimes are just verbatim in the text. Hunt for that question. Spend time there. That's exactly where I want us spending time because if you can find it in the text, you are gonna get this question correct. There's really no chance that you guess wrong. If you don't spend enough time on it, that's when an easy question like 30 can be wrong. So that's how we arrive to C for 30. All right, so question 31, we have, just like 30, a detailed question. According to the passage, blank, blank, blank. We see a lot of detailed questions on our science type passages on the ACT. When we see a detailed question, we know that this is a question we can get correct if we just spend the time this question requires. So I'm going to show you where in the text this is, okay? Right here is where we talk about the transit method. Okay. I would suggest as you're going through reading this passage, you're making little bits of annotation and this is where you might talk about what transit mode or method is, right? You might write that on your text. If you did that, you would know exactly where to go and see that during transit, we can figure out the chemical makeup of an alien world, right? Which perfectly aligns with answer choice A. It's directly there in the passage, all right? Now, There are some, you know, distractors here, right? Like gas giants are easier to find on with transits, but doesn't mean that that's what we can find from it. But the main thing is just we can positively identify it by using the passage to our advantage and understanding that a detailed question means it's going to be in the text. If you're missing a question like 31, you have to be annotating while you read through the passage before you get to these questions. So 31 is one of those questions where if you solve the passage and you annotated this thing right, and you kept a map of where everything was, you're going to get it correct. All right, question 32 is another detail question. We're just looking for this key term in the passage. If you missed this question, I'd say the first thing is you probably didn't annotate well enough while you were reading through the passage the first time. This is a perfect example where you can find your correct answer by just keeping track of the structure. Now, the answer choices that are wrong are compelling because of typically the baggage distractor. Okay, they're baggage distractors. So, super Earth, we're talking about, habitable zones, exoplanets that could have life, right? And we do know that Earth has life, so if something could have life, it might be like Earth. But we have to go by the passage directly. We can't be guessing about an answer choice like B or C because we think, oh, that's what this passage must be saying. We have to find it in the text. And we see that when we talk about super Earths, we see that researchers look into super Earths that are smaller than Neptune, but larger than ours, right? Which appear to be one of the most common types of planets in the galaxy. Okay. Um, there's no indication that these planets are habitable. No indication that they're rocky. No indication that they have biosignatures. In fact, we haven't really said that there are, seemingly habitable planets anywhere else in the passage. So, um, you know, look at this baggage distractor, right? Not in danger of warming, right? If you are concerned about getting off of this planet because you want to make sure that we have a planet that, isn't going to be subjected to the global warming or something like that, D might be compelling to you, but it's not attested to in the passage, right? We have to go with our safest inference for 32. On the ACT, over and over again, SAT as well, we find ourselves pulled by something that's more interesting, more compelling, but we oftentimes just have to go with the safest inference that has nothing wrong with it, which is what we see with answer choice A. All right, question 33. I want you to notice what I did for question 30. For question 31, I'm highlighting or underlining this wording right here where it says, according to the passage. When a question says, according to the passage, it means that this is a detail question. That means that our answer choice, the correct answer choice, is going to be directly in the passage. This is one of those questions where you just need to spend enough time to get it correct. Okay, so we're asked about the habitable zone around a star. Where do they talk about the habitable zone? Right here, right? None are in the coveted habitable zone, the region around a star where a planet's temperatures are just right for liquid water. Okay, so the correct answer is just directly stated there. Okay, all these other answer choices definitely are things where, you definitely need to have enough safety from stellar radiation in order for there to be habitation. You definitely need enough light for photosynthesis, right? But the only one that is directly stated in the passage is A. So a question like 33, you might be missing because you are at the end of a reading, you might be a little pressed for time, and you might be kind of allowing yourself to rush or guess on a question, which is a detailed question. But this is where you want to spend your time. This is where you can make your money back just by finding it in the text and answering. So that's why for 33, answer is A. All right, so 34 is yet another detail question. Oh, I just wanted to underline that in blue. Another detail question that asks us about something directly from the passage. So we know that our answer choice is going to be direct in the passage. But remember, with detailed questions, one of the most compelling answer choices that is incorrect, one of the most compelling distractors, is always going to be one which recycles language, which takes language from the text and just throws it in the answer choices. Didn't this passage talk about TESS? Yes, it did. Didn't this passage talk about the Kepler Space Telescope? Yes, it did, absolutely. But which of the following will replace the Hubble telescope? We know it's only going to be the James Webb because we're talking about Hubble's successor, right? If you are something's successor, it means you are coming in after it to replace it. So the James Webb Space Telescope is the successor. So that is what will be replacing the Hubble Space Telescope. Okay. Equating successor with replacement is not too far of an inference, but we do just want to make sure that we don't fall for the recycled language distractors on a question like 34. All right, so 35 is yet another detail question. We see a bunch of these at the end of the ACT very often because the ACT knows that we're stressed for time in a situation like this. So make sure you find this word accept. If you missed this question because you didn't read the word accept, not much I can say to help you other than read every word of every question and every answer choice. Now, if you miss this for another reason, understand that these questions, when they ask accept, they will take you a little while, right? Because you are going to have to ultimately navigate to find an answer choice. You're going to have to find every answer choice in the text but one. So you're going to have to look for discovering oldest stars, recording growth, exploring atmospheres, okay? How do we know? We also have to do a little bit of translation. So I'm going to show you where each of these are. So for A will look for highlighting in pink. It will seek out the first generation of stars. Okay, that means our oldest stars. So we saw pink. That means pink can't be missing. We're going to look at galaxy growth. Oops. So we have that right. Gosh. We have that right there, right? Track how galaxies grow. So we definitely have the green answer choice B. Then finally, exploring the atmospheres of distant planets. We will see this, right? Poke around in the planetary atmospheres of the few habitable super-Earths around M dwarfs, okay? So we see A, B, and C, which means the only one that, since we've seen all of those, we know that D is not going to be in the text. So we do have to do a little bit of translating. We have to understand that, like, first generation of stars means the oldest. But other than that, pretty straightforward question to get to D. All right, ultimately, question 36 is something, a main idea question. We're asked, how can the Kepler Space Telescope and TESS work together? Well, we see that they do that here, right? Kepler found all of these things, right? Whereas TESS will catalog the transiting worlds around the sun's nearest neighbors. So they work together in that form, right? And what are they ultimately doing? Just like everything here, looking for opportunities to discover life on other planets. All right, so that is how we arrive to our correct answer C. B is a recycled language distractor. Like, yes, we're looking at dwarf stars, but do they need to be nearby? No, Kepler can go really far. A is incorrect, even though they do talk about detecting radio signals. Detecting radio signals is something that we don't need this Kepler Space Telescope or TESS to do. And then finally, D, analyzing the composition of exoplanet atmospheres. If you chose this one, you might be confusing the Kepler Space Telescope with the James Webb Space Telescope, right? Kepler and Webb are different telescopes, and Kepler is more about seeing things far away and identifying things in transit. So that's how we arrive to C. We get rid of all the others and find that C is correct. So that brings us to the end of this reading section and the end of this fourth passage about planets for ACT.